Hi, I'm Dr. Paul Louis Metzger, and I'm the director of New Wine, New Wineskins. Welcome to New Wine Tastings, where every week we'll have an opportunity to engage people from diverse backgrounds, all in the attempt to build relational bridges through Jesus in contemporary culture. We are desirous of the opportunity to engage in deep and meaningful ways, and we're really thrilled and excited to have you with us. Hello, I'm Paul Louis Metzger, the director of the Institute for Cultural Engagement, New Wine, New Wineskins, and welcome to New Wine Tastings, where we're seeking to engage our contemporary culture in a manner that really seeks to reflect upon Christ and how Christ Jesus engages the world at large. And with that in mind, the time of year that we're found in presently is right before Halloween. Halloween, paganism, and the Satanic Panic is the focus of our conversation today. And so for helping me out, and I need a lot of help, we have Phil Wyman. This is one of his many, many faces that he wears. Phil Wyman, he's trying to deal with COVID. We have David Dashafin Keys, and we also have John Moorhead. And always take note of John's background. I mean, I like the background that David has as well, but John, just with that panorama, it's quite breathtaking every time we do this, these interviews with you. So again, we're going to be talking about Halloween, paganism, and the Satanic Panic. Before we begin, could we just share a little bit about where we're coming from, our stories, just very briefly? Phil, if you could take that off, please, so that people can see your beautiful beard and your delightful Tom Bombadil.
I'm afraid I'm going to get COVID from you guys.
Okay. But Phil, and then David, and then John, just share a little bit about your stories and areas of expertise. So Phil?
Yeah, so I spent the last 21 years in Salem, Massachusetts. I was pastoring a church for 18 of those. And when I moved there in 1999, I started working and trying to develop friendly relationships with the pagan community. And as an evangelical Pentecostal pastor, that's obviously not an easy thing. And so during that time, one of the things that happened immediately and surprisingly grew faster than the church. I always pastored a small church there in Salem, but was our outreach during Halloween. And that was its own problem, because not only was I trying to navigate relationships between neo-pagans, particularly in Salem, it's Salem tradition witchcraft. There's not many other varieties, druids or neo-shamans or even Wiccans. There's not a particularly large number of Wiccans there in Salem. Things seem to have descended from the teachings of Laurie Cabot and then dispersed into various Salem traditions. So it was navigating relationships between evangelical Christians and neo-pagans, which was a very difficult thing because of the thing we're going to talk about, the Satanic Panic of the 80s and 90s. It was still deeply embedded in the minds of Christians. But then we got involved in doing things during Halloween, and so we sponsored what was the largest stage during the month of October, outdoor stage with live music, and we were doing things like dream interpretation, and we had psalm readings instead of palm readings, things like that. And so we also had to navigate, how do you engage this holiday that in Salem, it's not one day, it's not the 31st of October, it's the entire month. And then it bleeds over into September and into November. So I literally planned for October starting on November 1st through to the end of, and I was already planning for the following year before we had finished October. So if I count the days, 20 years of 31 days of Halloween. I have more Halloween under my belt than probably any pastor who ever lived. And it was difficult to navigate. How do we as evangelicals work with this holiday that we've demonized? as much as we've demonized a category of people that, I speak anthropologically when I say neo-pagans, but pagans and witches and druids, and we demonized that category of people too. So yeah, it was the first years were kind of rough.
Well, and you can see for the viewers, from Phil, is well versed in this discussion, this theme today, and so he'll be sharing from that experience, his story, as we engage this theme of Halloween paganism and the Satanic Panic. David, please share a little bit about yourself too, and your area of expertise and the like.
Sure. So I am, at least for the purposes of this conversation, the actual token pagan on the call. So I have been bouncing around in interfaith circles really since the early 2000s. Little bit before that, really, too, maybe. In college, I was the president of my undergraduate Pagan Students Association, which sort of meant that I had to do a little bit of interfacing with folks, although to be fair, there were like 3 of us, so there wasn't that much to do at that time. And so I really think of my movement towards interfaith work and interreligious conversations and panel discussions and things of that sort to be when I moved to Central Illinois and got involved at the University of Illinois with their Pagan Students Organization, and later the Interfaith in Action group there at the university. And the rest is sort of history. It just became something of a passion for me. And so that
goes back to high school for you, or were you raised in a pagan home?
No, I was raised in a Jewish home, but my home was always multi-faith. My mother's side of the family is Christian and my father's side is Jewish. And so there was no way, even though the household that I grew up in, my immediate family practiced Judaism in the home, and we went to the synagogue, and I was bar mitzvahed, all that jazz. There was also no way to avoid baptisms and christenings and weddings and all of the other ceremonies of life that take place when half of your family, and just by statistics, just by number of people, the larger half of my family practiced a different religion. And so to some extent, you're correct. Interfaith and the concept of interreligious work and interreligious negotiation around space goes all the way back to my childhood. I have distinct memories of the dates in the calendar when Christmas and Hanukkah would overlap, because of the lunar nature of the Jewish calendar, that we would have the menorah in the window over here, and we'd have the Christmas tree in the window over there at Mammy's house, at my grandmother's house. And so there was always an aspect of interfaith and interreligious work and life to some extent. And so that continues from childhood to now.
Fascinating. And so we'll look forward to receiving your insights on this important subject, David. And John Moorhead, John, you're always thematically sound. So what T-shirt are you wearing today? Is it related?
Well, see, I wondered. This is it's not the Beatles. It's based on that T-shirt. It's the Beast of Horror. So we've got
Edgar Allan Poe,
Shelley and
Mary
Poe.
Shelley.
And Stoker and H.P. Lovecraft, so those influential horror folks. So there we go.
Do I get points because I realized that was Shelley and Poe? You get
50% credit. So there you go.
I interviewed them previously for this wine tasting, so they're always in the back of my head. So so John, a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, well, hopefully, David, I know he was talking tongue in cheek when he said he was the token pagan, but I want to make sure viewers know that, it's important to have these conversations, not only amongst evangelicals, but with others that, that are involved in our perceptions and our stereotypes. And so we're privileged to have David here to provide that pagan voice in the conversation. I'm the director of Multi-Faith Matters and the Evangelical Chapter of the Foundation for Religious Diplomacy. And in a nutshell, my journey after converting to Christianity was getting involved in an apologetically oriented form of understanding other religious traditions and the way to engage them. So basically, you refute them, you offer arguments against their worldview, and then supposedly that's supposed to give them warm and fuzzies about why they ought to consider a traditional Christian pathway spiritually appealing. And I found shortcomings in that theologically and otherwise. And I eventually started looking at cross-cultural missions, and anthropology appealed to me. And just the way that a missionary would embed themselves in a culture and develop relationships as they and serve as they tried to be persuasive at the same time. I found that appealing, and eventually I started looking at dialogue, and I finally came to the point where I asked myself the question: what do I do as a Christian living in a religiously plural world and country when I'm not evangelizing? And so that began kind of this multi-faith engagement, religious diplomacy process that the three of us evangelicals here have been immersed in for the last several years. And so I bring that, and as a part of my looking at other religious traditions from a different perspective, I knew Phil and his work with paganism. We both have some mutual colleagues in Australia, and they said, there's an interesting religious tradition out there called paganism, and you really ought to take a look at it. And so I started reading their materials and having online conversations, and I eventually flew out to Australia and saw how Australian Christians were relating not only to the new spirituality, but to pagans and so on. And have just found that fascinating, and did some of that during my seminary studies here in the greater Salt Lake City area. So all of that plays a part, my spiritual journey, and how we get to a place like this to have this important conversation today.
And so my friends here are all very well versed in the subject that we're discussing today, as you can tell from just their introductions. We only have so much time to go through it, but I encourage you to check them out via social media and their writing and public forms of engagement to get at more of what we're talking about today, because it really is a complex subject and a very painful subject, as we're going to get into this as well, with trauma and conflict and the like, and how to build understanding and trust in the midst of strong differences is key to what we're about here. So Halloween is this week, as I said earlier, and many evangelicals express concern over what they take to be pagan and satanic associations with the festive day. Why are members of the occult, quote unquote, or esoteric or magical religious traditions like pagans and Satanists of so much concern to evangelicals, particularly during the Halloween season? We'll talk about the Satanic Panic a little bit later, but why is this such a concern, especially during this season? Whoever wishes to discuss that, and we might not have time for all three to speak to each issue, but who would like to engage that question? Let's not all speak at once.
I'll go ahead and just go first with some just initial comments, and then maybe Phil can chime in. It'd be interesting to hear David's thoughts on why from that perspective. But I will say one of my concerns I have about evangelicalism in America, Jason Bivens, a scholar, a writer, has described evangelicalism in America as a religion of fear. And as I look at evangelical subculture, even though we talk about our belief in truth with a capital T and evidence that demands a verdict and all this great assurance, unfortunately, I don't see that working itself out a lot in practice. We kind of give evidence that we're not really as sure as we might like to think that we are. We have a lot of fears. And one of those fears, unfortunately, is fear related to Halloween. We see it, I think mistakenly so, as having a connection with satanic evil. And then we connect others to it and other minority religious traditions like pagans and like Satanists. And then again, that's associated with some stereotypes and I think historical misunderstandings and so on. And so one of the things I hope we can do in this conversation is shed some light on how we can overcome the fear by being better informed and by talking with people in certain religious traditions that we have the fears about.
But one of the things that I discovered pretty quickly, and I anticipated it when I moved to Salem, is that there's a rather militant approach to our spirituality within evangelical circles, and I think it more particularly fits with the Pentecostalism that has my tradition of pastoring. Spiritual warfare is a terminology that's tossed around quite a bit, and it at times becomes rather aggressive. So when people would come to Salem to want to get involved in the things we were doing in October, a lot of people with a spiritual warfare mentality. If we're going to take out the devil, and we're going to cast demons out of those witches, whatever else, they'd show up in town, and I would have to retrain them. In the first years, in 1999 through maybe 2005, at times it was extremely difficult because they wanted to come in and win the land for God, and cast out the devils and make sure the territorial spirits over Salem were prayed away. There's all kinds of terminology that comes from Pentecostal and third wave Pentecostal Christianity that can be very aggressive. And if people came to Salem with that mentality, my attitude was, you're not here to work with us. That's not going to happen unless you can become dialogical and learn to listen to people and to dialogue with people and find out where they're really coming from. You shouldn't be here. So I would do these training sessions, and I would introduce them to some of the witches in town, and I would talk about the difference between neo-paganism, particularly a Salem witchcraft, and Satanism, and how the two didn't particularly get along in Salem. For a lot of years, it was very difficult to find a Satanist in Salem. And it wasn't because of the Christians. It was because of the witches who thought these guys are giving us a bad reputation and we don't want them around. And a lot of that was birthed out of the Satanic Panic of the 80s and 90s. And a witch was obviously assumed to be, a worker of the devil doing his bidding and, creating all kinds of malicious things in the night, and especially on Halloween. So when you have to tell people that they don't eat babies, that there's not human sacrifice going on in town, and they're not coming to our churches and cursing us. When you have to tell people that kind of stuff, and you find out how often you have to do it, you get a sense for how badly the false information about witches and druids and pagans and heathen has infiltrated the church and caused us to be, respond in at least emotionally violent ways. I've had people try to cast demons out of me in the middle of a church service because I talked about our relationship with neo-pagans. That's it's a weird and wild world out there.
Yeah, and at New Wine, when we're dealing with the subject of how to build relational bridges through Jesus in contemporary culture, how Jesus brings about his kingdom is very different from the vantage point of how we see it in Christian American kind of ways, with the kind of conquest theme. He's hanging by a cross by a very thin thread in terms of how he brings about his kingdom. It's very different from conquest, this upside down kingdom of very vulnerable, holy love. And I just think it's a reflection of something else, like our fears that goes on with the conquest narrative, to your point, Phil and John. David, your thoughts, whether it's in response to Phil and John or just in terms of the question, or both?
Yeah, I think I feel the need, and maybe it's a surprising need at the moment, but I feel the need to rise perhaps to defense a little bit of some of my Christian neighbors. I kind of see how the process gets started that ends up in a place, Phil, where you're talking to the folks that you just described. There is centuries of baggage around terms like witch and pagan and heathen, maybe less so around druid. That's a term that I think most people maybe don't quite have as negative a connotation with, I don't think. But these are terms that have been in usage and in the vernacular with a negative connotation for a very long time. And so I think that some of the stories and the mythologies that we tell about people who might use these words, and historically speaking, very few people who were maybe charged with witchcraft were probably actually witches as we would think about it in the modern era. Probably none of them were as we would think of it in the modern era. There is an association between a sense of evil and a sense of evil practice and these words. There is also, I think, a growth of association between Halloween and an otherworldly presence, whether it is the influence of practices like All Saints Day and All Souls Day, whether it is the neo-pagan, modern pagan concepts of the veil between the living and the dead being thin and the ancestors being more capable, more easily contacted and sought for guidance during this time frame. There are themes that a person who doesn't have the vocabulary to fully understand what they're hearing and learning about might consider a problem. I think, though, that conversations like these, to John's point, are a way to help expand the vocabulary of people so that they start to say, oh, I see, this is different, but different doesn't necessarily equate to wrong or evil.
Thank you, David. Thanks so much for, your fairness in terms of really reflecting on the need for empathy of how people come to have these fears in the first place. There is a history of how terms have been used, historiography, things of that sort. I remember what one of my pagan friends said that, I think it was Eugene Pitzel Waters, we're back. And for a lot of Christians, like, wait a minute, we thought you were gone. How is it you're back? That can kind of mess, because there is this conflict that goes way back, way beyond our lifetime. We don't even know necessarily where some of this angst comes from, but it's in the bloodstream, it's in the water, it's in the pumpkin pie at Halloween and Thanksgiving. And
you've got scriptural sources that talk about the problematic nature of speaking with the dead, all the way back to 1st or 2nd Samuel. I don't remember which one the Witch of Endor is located in. So you've got pieces that are going to be important to Christians that say, be very careful about these sorts of practices. They are not great. I think what we have to recognize in the modern world is that what we're doing isn't necessarily that. What we do doesn't necessarily have to be connected to what was being warned about 2,700 years ago.
Yeah, and that's important. We'll get at least at a little bit of that today in this episode of clearing up the misunderstandings and the confusion, but it's in no way, shape, or form the attempt here to minimize the differences in terms of our sacred texts or what have you in traditions. We're not trying to do that. As we say at Multi-Faith Matters and New Wine, we're not trying to go around our differences or minimize the differences. We're trying to go through them to engage the religious other as a person, the spiritual other as a person, but not to minimize the differences when they're real differences, but to remove differences that are not truly the differences that we need to be concerned for. So with that said, just maybe David, you could speak to this because we have so many other questions that we need to get to for all three of you. But part of the misunderstanding can even involve Halloween. So, how does the pagan Samhain contrast with Halloween? And hopefully I didn't butcher the wording there.
You did. No.
Sorry.
In
that's
Irish,
the confusion. That's the confusion. I can't even get the words right.
Yeah. Well, it's not an English word. That's the issue. It's the MH becomes a W-like sound in Irish as it's then written with an English character set. So it's pronounced Samhain as opposed to Samhain, just Samhain. I can't explain linguistically why those letters were chosen to produce that phenome, but they were.
Did I get Halloween right?
Yes, Halloween you were good on. Yeah. So Samhain, as it's practiced in the modern pagan faith, is a harvest festival. It's considered the end of the harvest, so you will find feasting and some kind of get together being very common, though not this year for reasons due to the pandemic. it's also, as I said earlier, a time at which we believe that the distance between us and those who have died is at its shortest. That we can use spiritual techniques to reach out to those who are our ancestors, either within our family or people of historical importance that we would like to receive guidance from. And that as a spiritual practice is pretty common at Samhain as well.
Could you repeat that line? I'm sorry, could you repeat that?
Oh, which?
Could you repeat that line, David? Because it got caught. Just
yeah,
go back
yeah.
a few sentences.
Yeah, so I think so. I mentioned Harvest Festival and feasting. That part everybody sort of understands. The maybe less easily described piece is that, as a matter of spiritual belief, we hold that the distance between us and our ancestors is at its shortest during this time of the year. So it is possible through spiritual techniques, divination, things of that sort, to receive guidance from those who have died, and we think that is possible throughout the year, but it is perhaps easiest during this part of the year. So you will often find rituals that honor our ancestors or that seek to maybe even repair a relationship if your relationship with your ancestors was fraught. There's some of that going on, especially in the white North American context, because so many of our ancestors were at times not behaving in a way that we would consider to be culturally acceptable any longer, even if 100 years ago what they did might have been common. We know that is no longer the case. And so there's even a sense of reparative work that might be going on during this time of the year.
Very quickly, Phil and John, one of you want to add to that, or should I move on to the next question? Just one or the other?
Go ahead, Phil.
Yeah. So, being in Salem over the last 21 Halloweens, being in California is rough. This is my first October in 20 plus years without 31 days of Halloween. I'm not liking this very much. So I've seen a lot of the things that David is talking about, up close and personal with my, witch friends in Salem. Being at a dumb supper with them while they eat together and don't speak, and offer something at the head table to try and move on from the struggles of the past into something of the future, and offering something up for relatives. And there's a kind of a gentle kindness in that sometimes within evangelical Christianity we can miss engaging with our past and the people who have been a part of it in a way that is redemptive. Offers to us both a personal sense of forgiving and of forgiveness, that offers some kind of conciliation and coming to terms with the past. We do have a tendency to look toward a distant future and hang our hopes on a moment of redemption that comes with the second coming of Christ, and our heaven and hell tension, and all of those things. They're not that they're unimportant, but to forget what's going on now and not to place that within the context of ritual and liturgy in a way that brings hope for us is somewhat sad. And in that sense, I feel like the pagan community has given me a picture of engagement with the past. I don't have to change my theology to engage with my past in a redemptive way, but I certainly can learn from rituals that I see other people doing in other traditions that help me to, begin to move my way through the difficulties of life. So,
and we'll perhaps return to this theme as we deal with fear later, but Chris Stendhal, as we know, had this language of holy envy that I think you're picking up on, Phil, in response to what David has shared about our ancestors. And, and remembering, we don't have to discount our own theology. It might even remind us of something that is in our tradition, but we've lost sight of. And so we can appreciate, we can value something in another tradition, not to somehow become syncretistic. That's not something that historic Orthodox Christianity would be favorable toward. And I'm not calling for that, but it can remind us of something. It can be a source of holy envy. Holy, that we're still operating in keeping with our scriptures, but sense of envy, like a longing and appreciation for what we see in other tradition. As Leslie Newbegin said, whenever we have to look for the Achilles heel, we're always looking for the Achilles heel. That's a despicable form of Christian spirituality, when we cannot appreciate something good in another tradition. So it says something about that fear dynamic, while still accounting for what David rightly said about there's a history of this. We have to have empathy. At the same time, we also have to have empathy and appreciation for other traditions, as they may be speaking to a truth and a value that we actually find bound up with the image of God and also our own scriptures, but we've forgotten that and we've not seen it. So we might be able to come back to that. It might be best at this point, though, for a confusion that might be out there, not just with terms that I can't pronounce, but also to define pagan and Satanist and think through how they might or might not be related. How would you define and contrast the two, John? We'll just ask John for an answer at this point. We won't take time beyond that. But John, could you define pagan and Satanist in terms of the differences and the like?
Yeah, I'm always nervous defining another religious tradition when someone else, the practitioner's in the room, but I'll do my best to give a Reader's Digest version. The two are often conflated by Christians, especially evangelicals, and that's unfortunate. Pagans practice a nature-based spirituality. There are lots of there's a lot of diversity within paganism. Phil has mentioned some of the names of some of those Wiccan and witch and druids and heathens and so on. But again, it's a nature-based form of spirituality. You can be an atheist, you can be a polytheist, and so on. So there's a lot of diversity on the ultimate, on deity and this kind of a thing. Satanists, the pagans are misunderstood by Christians, but so are Satanists. Contrary to popular evangelical stereotypes, most Satanists are not theistic. They don't believe in the literal existence of the Christian devil, and they don't worship this being. In fact, the majority of Satanists are atheists. I've had some conversations and done some projects with a member of the Satanic Temple, and he's an atheist. There's a minority who would be theistic, like the Temple of Set, Michael Aquino's group. And what draws those two together, pagans and Satanists, in evangelical stereotypes, is the association with the Christian concept of Satan and the misunderstanding that they allegedly believe in and worship our devil, whether purposefully or just by virtue of the practice of their spiritual pathways. So one of the things we need to keep in mind as Christians is, in regards to these two traditions, is we often violate our own religious teachings in this regard, in that we frequently bear false witness against our pagan and Satanist neighbors. And so we need to make sure we understand what they actually believe in practice before we can say that we disagree with it and offer some kind of critique.
Thank you,
Is that
John.
fair, David?
Well, let's move forward with the conversation. Thank you, John. That was a helpful definition in your exhortation too, about not bearing false witness. If we want to be good witnesses, good witness entails making sure that we witness well to the reality of another tradition and what they really do stand for, and not discount, disparage, or distort what they stand for. So let's talk about the Satanic Panic. We've alluded to this a bit. I'd like to ask Phil about it from the vantage point of Christian tradition, and seeing it within evangelical Christianity. I think of some of Carmen's music or one of his songs back in the day that was, I think, a key song in this context.
The Witch's Invitation. Yeah.
Yeah, the Satanic Panic. And then I'd like for David, if he would please, to speak to what that Satanic Panic meant for the pagan community, existentially and the like. So, Phil, first.
So I wasn't raised in a Christian tradition. The closest thing, I suppose, more religious tradition that I was raised in would be somewhat of a New Age kind of thing. It was Christian Science, and so when I became a Christian in 1980, I was 21 years old, and I fell into this thing kind of at the front edge of this Satanic Panic. This is when Calvary Chapel was putting out movies about the demonization of rock and roll and and Halloween and satanic conspiracies, and Mike Warnke was wandering around doing his comedy show / testimony of being involved in witchcraft, and then it led to Satanism, and he had stories about doing things like blowing up a gas station with his mind. And then following that, there was the panic involved, to some degree, churches, but to a greater degree, child care centers where people were accused of sexually abusing children, and doing it under the umbrella of satanic ritual abuse. And he had Bob Larson on the radio casting demons out of people who were supposedly involved in witchcraft and all kinds of dark, terrible things like human sacrifices, and it was a bit of a show of it was more than a bit of a show. It was a terribly made up show, of which we go back and we look for those things, and people spent decades in jail, some people, for accusations of sexual abuse of children, and in the end we find out that psychologists were plying young children to come up with stories about a dungeon in the basement when a basement didn't exist in the building. Right down the street from where I am here in Long Beach, in Orange County here, there was one of the biggest, the McMartin case was nearby here, and there was a large one in Boston, where I moved from in November out here. So, it was all across the United States, but it was happening simultaneously in the UK. There were a number of names there that were driving the Satanic Panic, to the point that there were people who were training police officers to look for signs of occultism in criminal activity. And then later the police finally said, wow, this, we don't need this because this is just not happening like you're saying. We had something recently in the news. It just came up, something in Brazil where there's a, quote, satanic group that was doing some sacrifice. Turned out to be this was just a couple days ago, turned out to be, as you read it, that it was some Catholic variation, kind of a Catholic cult variation, where the guy was following a saint of death down in Brazil, and now it's described as being a satanic pagan group, and so this drives the story that we're telling. The narrative is being written again in a difficult way.
Thank you, Phil. And David, Phil, having articulated that, what was the response in the pagan community to the Satanic Panic? What difference did that make in, quote unquote, your circles?
Yeah. So it first should be said that the time frame of the Satanic Panic, I was a teenager. So most of what I can share here is me reading and looking back, as opposed to experiencing anything firsthand. Because at the time, I was either coming out of the Jewish practice after my bar mitzvah, and it was probably right about as I was learning about paganism. I think the ironic thing that the Satanic Panic of the time frame of the Satanic Panic is that it coincided in a lot of ways with a growth in Wicca specifically, because books started to get published, and Barnes and Noble started. You could go into the stacks at Barnes and Noble and find a book on Wicca and buy it and take it home to read it if you wanted to. And so there's a strange overlap of a time frame during which ideas associated with Satanism in a fictitious capacity that then get linked to paganism in an equally fictitious capacity. And yet there was also it almost drove an interest in some ways, I wonder, the practices of modern pagans. So in the late 80s and into the 90s, you have books being published. When the internet comes online, you have massive quantities of websites and resources becoming available to people through the early internet. And a lot of these things actually helped to bind something of a pagan community together in an effort to try and speak our truth and say what is being described by these panic-ridden statements is not what we do. And I think also as a way to network and determine what it was that we were doing across geographic distance, because the practice might have been very different for a person who was acting alone as sort of a solitary practitioner in, say, Texas versus a group of people, say a coven in New York City. But suddenly, for the first time, these two sets of people could communicate through the internet or through the back of magazines and correspondence and those sorts of deals. So there's an odd growth period in the same time frame of the Satanic Panic within the pagan community, fueled in no small amount by books and the internet. I do think that, and this is an opinion I have, I don't have any research to back this up at this time, but I do actually also think that the Satanic Panic altered the way that Wiccans, like myself, talked about Wicca, in that we had to try to describe how we weren't that. And we played an odd respectability politics through that time frame, which I think actually changed the way that Wiccans thought about ourselves in through the 90s and into the early aughts, to the extent that now, and I think for the last 10 or so years, Wicca is often thought of as introductory or lacking in a philosophical or theological grounding, and that it's just sort of a make it up as you go along, feel good about what you're doing kind of practice. And I think that that's related in some way to the Satanic Panic, because we had to tell other people that we were fine. We were totally normal. We just thought about things a little bit differently. And I think we started to believe I think we started in some ways to believe the line that we used to try to protect and deflect. And it has really only been, I think, over the last 5 or 6 years where books have been written about modern versions of witchcraft and modern ways of understanding Wicca that are linked to that past and linked all the way back to the early 20th century, when these ideas were starting to get some steam in Britain, that are recognizing that we're in a different space. We hope that we don't necessarily have to be quite as timid as maybe we felt like we had to be in the 80s and 90s.
You know, we only have about 8 or 9 more minutes to this episode, and you know, I'm reminded of the statement often attributed to George Santayana, or that he did say something to the effect of, "Those who don't understand history tend to repeat it." So, you know, Phil had already mentioned that there's like a reemergence of the Satanic Panic going on. He referred to a story in Brazil, and but our fears generated a reaction of fear of a distortion, really, of not really articulating who you really are in a way that you'd want to voice what your movement really is. And you've reawakened, so to speak, as I hear you, David, about this is how we'd like to articulate what we are, not in reaction based on the Satanic Panic, but going back further to the early 2000s, or early back to the 20th century, rather, to really voice who we really are. And for we as evangelicals, when we operate by way of fear, we're not really speaking ultimately from who we really are. And I think, how do we operate in a way, not so much by fear, certainly caution where there needs to be caution, our moral intuitions that John and I talk about with, social psychology. We need to be concerned for our traditions and what our traditions are about, with authority, purity, and the like, but also equity and fairness. So how can we learn from the mistakes of the past to articulate who we are better and engage one another better in the remaining 6-7 minutes? Let's start with John, since he has to go most quickly off the scene. And then David and Phil, what can we learn from the past, from this context of fear, and to operate more, not from fear, but ultimately discernment moving forward? John.
Yeah, I hope we can be discerning, but Phil mentioned it briefly when he was talking about this. Unfortunately, the satanic panics of the 1980s and 1990s are seeing something of a resurgence in the contemporary period in connection with conspiracy theories, and particularly QAnon, where anonymous sources are making the allegation that leading Democrats are are a part of an underground network that are taking children and part of a satanic cabal to sacrifice these children. A gentleman took this seriously and broke into a pizza place that supposedly had this going on in a closet. He went in with an automatic weapon, and there was no satanic sacrifice going on. And so this has been repeated. So for whatever reason, throughout the history of Christianity, including evangelicalism and fundamentalism, we keep going back to the same boogeyman. We keep going back to Satanists and Satan and cannibalism and this kind of a thing. In the earlier Christian history, we associated that with the Jews. In more recent times, we're doing it with Satanists and pagans. And so a part of what we have to do is just try and fight that, whatever it is in our tradition and our mindset and our spirituality, to go back to that boogeyman and say, wait a minute, let's talk to the people involved. Let's look at the evidence. Let's look at the data and see whether or not this is really taking place, and fight our immediate intuitions and assumptions to try and hopefully come out at a better place to assess these things more fairly and accurately, because they do have real serious repercussions in politics and how we treat each other in the public sphere.
And I think it's important that we have conversations with pagans themselves. I mean, you can just tell, for the fellow evangelicals out there, David's a normal person. In fact, I'd say David's probably far more normal than Phil and John. Okay, me too. But David, your thoughts?
I think you all strike me as perfectly normal. Oh, you meant on. There's a phrase that comes out of the pagan community. I'm going to actually step back a couple of seconds for one moment. There's actually, I think, a similarity between some forms of evangelical Christianity and paganism, in that I think both spiritual traditions see the capability of having a direct and personal relationship with the divine. We think about what that divinity is in different ways, but I think both apprehend that relationship, that communication is possible. And in the pagan community, there's a form of that communication that is sometimes referred to as sock puppeting. And what it is that if you've got a sock puppet, whatever you want it to say is you're in complete control of that sock puppet. It's not its own separate entity. And so if you are encountering something that you maybe don't understand, or something that causes you to feel fear, I think one of the things that I've learned to do is to stop and say to myself, is this simply what you're telling yourself? Are you sock puppeting at this moment? Are you only reinforcing the thing that you already thought was true, regardless of whatever other information might be out there? Or are you experiencing this information from someone or something or some entity, someone else, in a way that doesn't jive with your own sense of what might be going on. And in actuality, sometimes the stories we tell ourselves is the false narrative. It maybe even often the story we tell ourselves is the false narrative, because we actually just don't know. And so, as John, you were saying, it behooves us to take the opportunity when we're hearing a reinforcing narrative to just do the best we can to try to say, it can't be this simple, because very rarely are things this simple. And so what is actually going on? And that takes an effort and a force of will and a real willingness to be humble about the amount of information that we have gathered for ourselves and what we're good at, because we're not all good at everything. And that when our own lack of information is being reinforced in some way, that's unlikely to produce anything other than negative results. Maybe not as negative as, say, in the Satanic Panic, with people going to jail and losing livelihoods and jobs and houses and everything else. But I still think that operating from a lack of information being reinforced through your own stories and storylines is just not an effective way to try to be authentic in life.
Thank you, David. And Phil, closing thoughts.
Yeah, so it does feel a bit like the season we live in right now. The pendulum is swinging back toward a satanic panic moment, and I say that from the perspective of having spent the last 20 years trying to educate evangelical Christians on how to navigate relationship with neo-pagans when they would come to Salem. So I've literally seen thousands of Christians come through, work with us, and in the early days, talking about it when I would train them for, our month of Halloween, get all kinds of funny looks. I'd be accused of, promoting some kind of satanic thing. It was very difficult. And then as in the last 8-10 years, it became easier and easier, to the point where I would share information about neo-pagans and who they were and how we needed to love them and understand them, and they weren't satanic as we had supposed. And a crowd of people would cheer. The pendulum swung dynamically, at least, within our group of people we were working with. But in the last couple years, it seems to be moving back, but it's not moving back in a straight line to the same place. Now the demons that we fight aren't specifically the neo-pagans, but we're creating a satanic panic, I suppose somewhat birthed out of QAnon type of stuff, and now it's socialists and communists and a cabal of evil leaders within politics who are supposedly killing children in order to get their what is it? What's that stuff called? John, you should know this. I know you do. Anyway, the adrenochrome. To get the adrenochrome to drink, and and there's all this sexual abuse going on underneath it, and we're calling it a satanic cabal, right? But one of the things that I learned so much through the process of engaging with the neo-pagans is that if we don't actually know the people that we're talking about, we probably shouldn't talk about them. Otherwise we're creating our own fake news. We're exploding something into some exaggerated picture that, gets the biggest offering in church or the greatest response, creates people to be passionate about what we're doing. And we shouldn't be passionate about aggressively going after others. We should be passionate about aggressively loving others. Just a quick example of that. I don't know if you remember from the later end of the Satanic Panic, there was the West Memphis Three. And Damien Eccles was kind of the big name in that group. Well, for a short period of time after Damien Eccles got out of jail. They decided, wow, these guys have been accused of something falsely, and they were let out of jail. Damien Eccles had his office directly above mine in Salem. He moved to Salem because it was a place he was always interested in. He's I suppose a neo-pagan with kind of a combination of biblical interest in the Bible and other New Age interests, kind of combines it all together in a type of heathenism that's very, very, I suppose, common for an eclectic spirituality. And he would come downstairs and stand. The door into his office was pretty close to the front door of the church. I'd come out and stand around. He'd come out and stand around. We'd talk. And Damien Eccles is kind of an intense character, but he had a real gentleness about him. And, when people start talking about things and they don't actually know the individuals, we make up stories that we heard from somebody else, and we take the best and most dramatic stories and we retell them, and we pass on this fake news. And I don't think we should be engaging stories about the socialist and communist other without actually knowing who they are, in the same way that we shouldn't be engaging stories about neo-pagans during Halloween without having discovered who they are as individuals. After thousands, literally meeting thousands of witches and druids and heathen and hundreds of them being acquaintances and friends, I know the stories are not what have been told from decades back, and fortunately aren't being told with the same vehemence today that they were back then.
Well, thank you, Phil. We need to head out at this point, but we're not going to head out to discount what's been shared. But really, as we all leave, how do we think through getting beyond the stereotypes, the sock puppeting, and to read, yes, our scriptures, but also read the works of pagan leaders to understand what they themselves think about themselves, what they themselves would articulate about their traditions, while also hoping that they would understand us for what we truly are, and not based on fear and our concoctions of fear that we might put forth. So I think the word here is to really get to know one another, to understand one another in a transparent way where we build trust and get to know the other. Thank you very much. For Phil Wyman, David Dashoffin-Keys, John Moorhead, thank you all for joining me at New Wine Tastings, where we deal with the subject of Halloween, paganism, and the Satanic Panic. Blessings to all of you. Have a wonderful, wonderful week. Blessings. Goodbye.